And I've certainly found out a lot of things the hard way about playing the piano, and I certainly don't have all the answers. None of us ever do. But I hope that I'll stimulate thought on things. You all represent a wide range of age and experience here. There's some people young enough to be my grandchild, and some could biologically be a parent. But I hope everybody will at least practice with a little more enthusiasm when they go to the piano next. I want to cover a very wide range of subjects today, and I've targeted to last 2 hours. I'll probably run over a little bit, but I've tried to keep things succinct. But I want to touch on so many areas, and what may be of some interest to some people may be of less to others. But I feel everything that I'm covering is important to Chopin and to Schumann and to playing the piano in general. I was an injured pianist myself for over a decade. And during that time, it was a long, exhaustive search, experimenting myself, going to anybody that I thought could help in any way, shape, or form to solve this, to allow me to play again, and then to pass on what I learned to others. It ended up being a blessing in disguise, miserable as it was, because it made me a better pianist. Didn't make me more confident being in front of people when nerves attack, but in terms of understanding the instrument and being able to do things, at least on one's own, it left me a lot further along than it was before, and more of a vocabulary to share, a more beautiful pianist and a more efficient pianist. So I want to cover some of those ideas because they're especially of critical importance for playing Chopin and Schumann. They might be a little less essential for Bach or for driving toccatas of the 20th century, but for that golden age of pianism that Chopin and Schumann are right in the middle of, I think it's very important. So bear with me if I end up talking a fair amount before actually showing examples. I'll then go to examples of Chopin and later on of Schumann as well. The first portion, I should say that rather than half, is the longer part. So don't assume the second half is as long as the first. And we'll keep the break very, very, very short. Won't be having food or anything, because we're all such good friends. We start talking, and it's hard to get going again. And some people do need to get home at the end of the day. So we'll keep it just a couple minutes, if that's okay. And then we can visit as long as Gary will put up with me. I'll stay and answer questions or talk. I love this stuff, and I love to share it. And as I say, I'd like to get to know you all better as well. The main advice I want to give is to persevere in this quest. It is so daunting. It is so overwhelming. To play the piano beautifully, I don't know anything harder in life to do, especially in front of people. And it's a very frustrating thing. We always feel like we're going forward and then backwards. There's so many things that we battle, so many internal demons, so many things that lessen our confidence, our feeling I don't know enough, or I'm not good enough, or I should have done this. And the daily frustration of practicing far outnumbers the joy, I think. This is a very accomplishment-oriented and fulfilling thing to do over the long term, but on the short term, it's just full of discouragement all the time. And I think the answer just has to be to hang in there, to realize when maybe things aren't going so well and step back temporarily and evaluate things. The answer is not just dogged forcing things every moment when we're at the piano, but to have an overall philosophy that's a lifelong quest. I'd like to say that rather than struggle, but it is a struggle. Ultimately, the solution has to come through relaxing psychologically and physically at the instrument. But it's a daunting thing to do. Our goals are to play like the great people we've admired. They paid a price to play like they play, to play like they have been able to play. We often don't realize that. And those were exceptional creations of the universe. But we can all play beautifully, and we can all enjoy the process of working at this, and that's what we have to do, is just enjoy being on the mountain, even though none of us will ever make the summit. This is also a very evolving process. Just this morning, I was still sort of adding and taking things out of this and came across something I'd never read before from Felix Weingarten, the great conductor of a long time ago. He wrote a book on conducting. And apparently near the end of his life, he asked somebody, did they have his book? And the person said, oh, of course. And he said, well, go burn it. Because his ideas have so evolved since writing the book. Schnabel was going to redo his edition of Beethoven's sonatas. Leschetizky, there's a famous story, corrected a student on something at a lesson, and the student said, but last week you told me to do it this way. And he said, well, that's because I've evolved this week, and you haven't. That we are all continuously growing. And if I'd given a presentation 20 years ago, I kind of cringe, even though I would have been 42 then, because my ideas have come a long way since then. I hope I won't cringe if I live 20 years from now, but undoubtedly a few details at least I would see differently. But that's the nature of an art, and something that, while it's mathematics oriented in many ways, still isn't a science, but is an art. So the plan for today is to go through a little bit on Chopin background, then how to play the piano, and then have examples with Chopin. And then with Schumann, we'll do a little bit on Schumann the man, Schumann's music. I won't be doing as much from a pianistic point of view or even interpretive point of view in a note-to-note sense. That'll be in the first portion, and that's applicable to Schumann. But mainly with Schumann, he's such a strange, original, unique composer that where we can all identify with Chopin, people who really know nothing of music. Schumann is a much tougher nut to crack as a listener and as an interpreter. So I want to approach it from the German Romanticism that he so very vividly represents. There's a bibliography that I handed out, starting on page 2 of the handout. We'll come back to the first page. And much of the material pertains just to Schumann or Chopin, but some of it I think is really essential for a serious musician's library, and I just wanted to highlight a few of those. The Clive Brown book is a masterpiece of pulling together performance practice from that whole era that we play. That'll cover Bach, that'll cover classical works, that'll cover the Romantic era. And it substitutes for reading all those treatises oneself. I mean, there's thousands of pages of reading to do if one's going to go back and read C.P. Bach and Turk and Glantz and all those people. And Brown has done it for you here. He's mainly oriented towards the Romantic era in many ways, but I think it's well worth having and well worth the cost. The De Vario is an excellent book on Schumann if you're wanting a Schumann biography. I'm indebted to Tabner for even knowing the existence of the book. He's a wonderful resource on history of piano and piano literature. However it's pronounced, Heidelberg or whatever, the Chopin pianist and teacher is where much of the information that I'll pass on about Chopin's teaching and playing and coaching is found. It was originally in French, and I was so sad I couldn't read French when I saw that many years ago, but it's been in English for a good while now and is available. I think every serious Chopin player would want to have that. The next Schumann book's very nice, easy to read. The Kenneth Hamilton is a gem because we spend so much time researching how do we play Bach, how did they do things in the Baroque, and so often we don't really know well what they were doing back in the time of Liszt, the time of Chopin. And this Hamilton book really is eye-opening to how those great pianists played in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, 90s, on into the 20th century. And it's very easy to read. The Jensen Schumann, very accessible, easy to read book also. The Ostwald is very controversial. He takes the point of view of Schumann being so manic depressive and being a psychiatrist himself who lived up in the Bay Area. He also wrote on Glenn Gould. He liked to pick these unusual topics and people. But a lot of it's conjecture from his analyzing different things into it. So it's not bad to have as one of many Schumann biographies. I wouldn't read that as the only one because it's so conjectural on many ways. In fact, the book by Werthen kind of was written to counteract the Ostwald book, and he takes a much more positive view of Schumann's mental state. The Poli book, I think, is a gem, and it's hardly known at all. I wouldn't have known the book except for two different people from two different piano organizations that I belong to recommended it to me, and it's full of insight. Charles Rosen is an absolute genius. Not only was he a significant pianist, he just died a few months ago, but nobody knows how to look at a music score and convey what's really in there from the whole historical, intellectual, theoretical, but sound point of view. Rosen isn't bedtime reading, but I urge it for people with significant background. He wrote a book, The Classical Style, which would never be matched in terms of understanding the classical era. You go through him slowly, and you savor it, and it's exceptional. Alan Walker is mainly a Liszt scholar. Sometimes I'm asked, I want a biography of Liszt. To me, there's only one, and it's very easily read. There's 3 volumes, 500 pages each, but it is bedtime reading, believe it or not. That's Walker's book on Liszt. Everything else is full of old wives' tales and nonsense are incomplete. Walker's devoted his life to these great romantic people, mainly Liszt, but the Schumann book is old. David Duval's book, I think every pianist would want to have. There's no book of its kind that covers performers, literature, recording like his does. And there's a new expanded edition. If somebody wants to get a friend or spouse or whatever, a book they don't have on piano playing, that's the best one to have, because it just covers everything and his opinions are very sound. The Rosenblum book deals just with the classic era as opposed to the Brown one earlier on. It does more. But performances in classic piano music, she's got it all there. Again, there's maybe more detail than you want on a simple, quick answer, but it's not so complex that one can't put together, and it'll save you a lot of time. My own dissertation ended up being very similar to what hers is, but I never wanted to go through publishing and all that stuff of mine, so I was thankful to see hers come out a few years later and can vouch for the accuracy of it. The other books on that also for your reading, there's 4 of them there, deal with feeling music, really, and in a way that's not so seen on the printed page. They all deal with an aspect of grouping and forward motion and direction, and to me that's where it's at. And I think grabbing anyone, the McGill one is very new. Some of those others may be out of print. Matte was the first to really talk about that. But I think that McGill one really puts it together, and you'll find it very eye-opening, and it's applicable to what one would play at their first lesson in music study. I've incorporated some of the ideas in here. So those are all for further research. Chopin as a man, what do we really need to know about him? His father was French and brought the precision and the order into Frederick. The mother was the dreamy, sensitive side, Polish. The Polish nationalism was always important to him. He wasn't an ardent nationalist in the sense of being out politically, really part of the Polish movement, but his identity as a Pole was certainly very, very meaningful to him throughout his life, without doubt. The Parisian salons, the aristocratic atmosphere, that's the environment he lived in. He mainly taught aristocrats, and they weren't very good pianists, but he traveled in this orbit of the salons. His personality traits, mostly craving a perfection, an elegance, a simple dignity, a feeling that there's limits and proportions, that everything should be done just right, should be very proper. He had a great dislike of disorder and over-exuberance. And people said of him, simplicity is everything, and he had a horror of excess and exaggeration. So it doesn't sound like a romantic composer, and in many ways he wasn't. There's a book entitled Chopin Reluctant Romantic. I haven't read that book, but the title summarizes it. This whole thing of who's classical and who's romantic is really kind of a problem that leads to a lot of misunderstandings. If we look at the big overview of music history going back centuries and centuries, music cycles recur, real big changes every 150 years. We've kind of gotten the idea, because we've looked just, I call this classic, I call this romantic, I call this 20th century, that they change quicker. But you can go way back. This is not my own idea. Great musicologists have really proven it. You go back to the beginning of the Renaissance in music, that's about 1450. And the Middle Ages were maybe 150 years before that, the medieval. Then you've got the Baroque at 1600. You've got what we call classic era, which continues into the Romantic era from 1750 to about 1900. Then we've got a radical change into our 20th century music. Those were monster changes every 150 years. Everything about style changed. There may have been philosophical things changing and things in literature and art, and there were at those times too, but musically, they were radical changes around those times. Each of those 150-year periods has a 75-year cycle and another 75-year cycle. The earlier of all those cycles is simpler, more refined, more reserved, smaller scale. The second 75 years in each one becomes more exuberant, grander, or maybe more intimate, but certainly feeling takes over. And much more color and much more nationalism. It happened in all those centuries. So when we're fighting over in 1825, are we in the classic or romantic era? And in Schubert, a classicist, there's he romantic, and what do we do about Mendelssohn, and what do we do about Chopin, and then there's Brahms later on, what do we do about him, and what do we do about Verdi and Donizetti and Rossini and all this? It's kind of pointless. What's significant is what was their temperament? Were they a classical sort of person, Or were they, in their ideals and outlooks, were they a romantic person? Obviously, Liszt is the romantic, Schumann's the romantic. Chopin, as a person, is more the classicist. His favorite artist was Ingres. I can't speak French, so I'm mangling it somewhat, but it's spelled Ingres. And I think every pianist should look at some of Ingres' paintings and see how classical they are, how orderly they are, how precise they are. Chopin said to his friend Delacroix, I really like you as a friend, but I don't relate to your art. Delacroix was a romantic who got animals out there chewing up each other and war and all this drama and this sweep and this sort of frenzied activity, but it's Ingres that Chopin related to, who actually the Impressionists grew to detest because he represented that sort of precise, classical, every hair is in place, every woman's dress is so elegant with every little detail, and so I think it's beautiful art, but it's very orderly and it's predictable in a sense. Now, Chopin's harmonies are wildly romantic, so I'm not saying in every way he's a classicist, but there's a difference of temperament and musical materials that may be used, and when you look at him as a person, he's very different than Liszt. They were colleagues. Chopin was uncomfortable around Liszt. Liszt had such an enthusiasm about him that if you were a little shyer and quieter, you tended to pull back a little bit. That was the main problem with Liszt. That ended up, not only was there a lot of professional jealousy, but a lot of people just didn't understand quite this great intensity and energy, even though it was usually very positive. Liszt was very kind. Chopin was biting. But Chopin was proper, and Liszt was larger than life all through his life. Chopin only made 30 public appearances beyond childhood. Only 7 or 8 were in Paris, and the last one in Paris was in 1835. I mean, he hated playing in public, would play for a few friends in the salon environment, but we shouldn't have the image of him as playing in concert halls. Of course, even then, the concert halls were much tinier than today. And that his heart was in the salon. His own style of playing was very, very intimate. It was really based on exquisite nuances, a delicate touch. Some people called it otherworldly. He was a very reserved player. One student once said, do you think he would have done well in these international competitions? I don't. And I agreed with the student. It really is not what the world often looks for, filling a 4,000-seat hall with sound and having a temperament that leaps off the stage and casts a spell on everybody. That simply wasn't his style. He wasn't really interested in literature, not involved in that romantic movement or romantic philosophy at all. We know he was quite a good mimic and apparently had a latent temper that expressed itself in sarcasm. In his music, it's the originality that was stunning. There had never been any music like that before. The key thing that was different was it exploited sound. When Beethoven wrote a piano sonata, the original ideas in his head could have been for a symphony, it could have been for a string quartet. It was more like the Baroque. Bach would write a work for strings and then transcribe it for winds. There wasn't so much that necessity of the exact medium being the foundation for the music itself. That ingredient of sound, I mean, we can put across a moving Beethoven performance with not always the most elegant sound on every note. You can't do that with Chopin. You at least need the appropriate sound on every note with Chopin, and it's often elegance. And so oftentimes the great interpreters of Beethoven are not the great interpreters of Chopin and vice versa. But we have to put ourselves back in the 1820s, 1830s when these people are hearing this poetry, that there had been sensitivity in music before, but this continuous poetry was so new. Chopin's structures, one can talk all day on. We're not going to go into that area, but that's too often overlooked. And it's also overlooked the embellishment that he did. It's so expressive. The way when a repetition comes, it's different and it's so poetic. It's not notes. I mean, the Baroque had a lot of embellishment. You can't say every note in Baroque embellishment is poetic. But in Chopin it is. And he was always devising new ones, improvising them on the spot. But it's not concert hall music. It's more polyphonic than we ever think. And that's one of the secrets to interpretation. His 2 idols for playing himself were Bach and Mozart. That's who he practiced. Didn't care for Beethoven. He taught Opus 26, none of the other Beethoven sonatas. Mozart for the simplicity and the classicism, and Bach for the counterpoint. And the older Chopin got, the more complex the counterpoint got. And especially when you look at those later works, that's what makes it so overwhelming, as well as the harmonies. But very special harmonies were there earlier, but the counterpoint evolved and evolved and evolved. So Bach, Mozart, huge influences, and the opera singers. Who was he hearing at the Paris Opera? Bellini, Rossini works, and he loved those, and he was there all the time. And then there are also models of Hummel and Field and Carl Maria von Weber in terms of some of the figuration that he used. My thoughts about Chopin and all this background on him. He loved the Pleyel piano. There was the Aurora and the Pleyel, and they're both very, very different from what we have today as a modern piano. I played on a 1848 Pleyel several months ago that was quite interesting to do. It's so different from today. And the Pleyel was the more poetic of the two. Our venues have changed. He was playing in these very small environments, and now we've got the big concert. I mean, the world has changed. Audiences have changed. I don't think the answer is to try and imitate Chopin. You can't imitate anybody else anyway. I think that's one of the problems going on with very many prominent pianists even today in contests and so on. We've got to be ourselves. But if we have the background of having explored what made Chopin tick, it's very relevant. I think in the delicate pieces we have to be careful not to overplay, to keep the restraint, the subtlety, the mystery. In a sense, we can approach him as highly colored, pedaled Mozart. He looks back to Mozart. He really is in a line of Couperin, Chopin, and eventually Debussy, as far as those great French composers. And Debussy related to Chopin enormously, played Chopin effectively even as a child, and just adored Chopin and was so aware of that lineage. Couperin, Chopin, Debussy. And I think it doesn't hurt to study a little bit what makes Debussy tick. He always said, I'm not an impressionist, I'm a symbolist. And the symbolists were ones who explored the subconscious and were fascinated by sound of the language itself, much as Debussy was, fascinated by mystery, and wrote all this very atmospheric, suggestive type of poetry, which is what Debussy's music does. And I think if Chopin had gone on and lived decades more, maybe he would end up sounding a lot like Debussy. But in the dramatic pieces, I don't think we have to be overly restrained. If we decide, well, I want to play like Chopin, and he played very small scale, we've zapped a piece of the strength, the power. And Chopin was a tough guy inside. We can tell from the music, the intensity, the drama, the at times almost violence in the music has to show. C.P. Bach said, what is the purpose of performance? And he said it's to reveal the true character of the music. So the character in the drama has to be there. That's going to be in the bigger pieces, which often have quieter moments that we overlook. And I think that the trick is to stay warm. It's the harshness and the angularity that I don't care for in some performances of the bigger works. It's not the fact that the sound is big. I think you can make it as big as you want if it stays warm and if it stays lush and stays beautiful. That golden age of piano didn't want ugliness in playing. It's the same with singing. Of course, you want to have a powerful voice. You want to have a huge voice in romantic opera. But Wagner begged the singers to make the model of singing his operas Italian opera singing, which was bel canto. It was based on beauty. The idea that you can bark and growl and scream in Wagner is way misplaced. The great Wagnerian singers he asked for, and the great coaches today ask for, a beautiful line and beautiful singing. Sure, it's big, but it should stay beautiful. Occasionally, Verdi wanted his witches to have rather raspy voices in Macbeth. Again, but that's for the drama of a certain character, for a little bit of effect. Overall, and that's one of the battles of playing the piano, how to balance beauty of sound versus the drama that's in the music. And it's a tough call to get it just right. In playing, it's not a talent or an inspiration primarily. It's a process that we all can do. I believe we can all play convincingly and expressively if we have the right tools and select the right repertoire for performance. I think very often we're eager to work with a certain piece, but maybe that's a piece to be better worked in lessons or on one's own than necessarily when it's an ordeal as it is to perform. And there's so many things to think about in the piece. But if we use these tools that I'll try and give today, they're relatively simple. They boil down to a few things. You can read thousands of pages of books and spend a lot of time at the piano, but to me it boils down to what's on the first sheet there that we'll get to in a minute. Not everybody can have great facility, no matter how hard we practice. Not everybody will have great ease, no matter how hard we'll practice. We can increase our facility, we can increase our ease. There's no doubt about that. But it doesn't mean we can all be the most facile, most relaxed pianist in the world. But I really believe we can all play beautifully. And making beauty is what, to me, this art is all about. And even a piece that may have relatively simple notes, to make it beautiful involves a lot of decisions and a lot of practice in order to play beautifully. We can look at that list on the first half of the first page there. I really have tried, I revised when I gave this a couple weeks ago to the other amateur pianist members. I thought it was too cumbersome, so I wanted to simplify it still more. The older I get, the more I realize everything needs to be simple, or it's probably not very true or very workable. So I made it as simple as I can, even though it's not easy. That's two different things. But to me, this is it. I'm going to cover the physical means, first of all, which I have there, and a little asterisk means Chopin emphasized it as recorded in this book. It was part of his teaching. It doesn't have an asterisk. I don't think he would disagree with it, but it's not directly from him. So let's look at I'll read a lot of quotes either from his students or he himself in terms of the physical means. The touch of the pupil always appeared too hard and rough. He could not bear too loud a sound from the piano and called it a dog barking. Caress the key, never bash it, is what he said. Mold the keyboard with a velvet hand and feel the key rather than striking it. His specialty was extreme delicacy. And to me, this beauty of tone comes from a non-percussive touch. Doesn't mean that we can't have the hands from above the keys and make a preparatory motion into the keyboard. That helps me to relax. That helps many pianists. We've seen Rubinstein up here and so on. But as one comes down into the key, there's going to be a moment where you ride the key down, where you're sensitive to what the key is doing. It's not just going to be a free fall banging right into the key. The hammer responds as the key is treated. And I think whenever we're practicing, again, there's a few exceptions, maybe parts of Prokofiev or something, or parts of Baroque music. But when we're playing, most of what we play on the piano is that sense of loving every keystroke that we make and enjoying that aspect of playing. If we can think of just melting into the key, because the goal is just to make that key an extension of us, whatever sound we want it to be. It should just feel that it transmits from our own inner ear and heart with no obstruction right out into the key. So that's going to come from technically what's called a non-percussive touch. I don't use non-percussive in the sense it has to be quiet and intimate all the time. That's a non-percussive touch. I love this piano. Because I want an instrument that will give hugeness, but warmth, and also that'll give the greatest delicacy. And we think, who are the great pianists that the world has loved? Well, Liszt had that big range. That was one of the key things of his effect. It wasn't that he played fast. He probably didn't play quite as fast as we think he did. But he had this humongous sound, and he had this tiny delicacy. Where did he learn the delicacy? Chopin. He showed up in Paris, and he was quite mechanical. Great ear, a lot of facility. But when he heard that poetry from Chopin, he realized, wow, here's what a piano can do. So he took it and ran with it, exploited that delicate shading. So the people who heard Liszt said, the staggering thing is how soft he can play. But then he can be so loud. In a way, I think it was sort of like a Horowitz, although hopefully without the percussiveness Horowitz in certain stages had. But that idea of running the whole gamut from so big to so small, because that's what the piano literature does. But even when it's big, if we just view that the touch is proceeds right from the key. And an important idea is we have to, in a way, divorce some of the emotions that we're feeling from our physical approach. The tendency is if something's loud, we want to use the whole body and dive at it. And then if something's soft, we end up tensing up and shying away from the instrument. There was a radical thought when somebody presented to me when I was very much an adult, the idea that it should be exactly the same process. If we're going to play fully, we can play fully. If we're going to play softly, we can play softly. I think of Rubinstein. He pretty much had that through so much of his career. He sat there so regally and so serenely, but could get the huge sound, get the delicacy, and didn't have the body all immersed with it. It is so hard to feel music, which we do, or we wouldn't be doing this, and keep the body relaxed. If you don't feel music, you can stay relaxed. If you feel music, there's a physical response that can make us actually tense and tight, and then throw in the emotions, which, again, that will convey to listeners how much we love the music we're playing and how much we want them to love it. We're actually tying ourselves up in knots. We have to see it's the same approach, whether it's piano or forte, and it's not only that the fortes will be a little more cushioned, we're able to hear the sound that comes out, because it is so hard when we're feeling music to hear it. It's two different things, the intent that we have versus what's coming out. And if we can hear what's there, Leontine Price says in performing that she sang off the interest and not the principle. You've got to have a reservoir of emotions behind you, the life experience, but you don't want it getting all tangled up in your fingers and arms, and then you can't really communicate it, and we can't hear ourselves. I find it helpful to think of bringing the sound toward me. Much of the time, that's the default approach that I have. It's more of this, and I'm not talking about taking the fingers and scratching along the keys, but the general idea is that I'm wanting to use the arm to make the sounds, and it allows to control the key better. And we really make dynamics and color by controlling the speed of the key descent. Big discussions about arm weight and so on. We could put down a 10-ton object and have it go down so slowly and get no sound. It's the speed that the key goes down. The weight concept can be helpful if one's a teacher and you're groping for imagery and you use the word weight and the student gets a fuller sound. I use it sometimes myself, but I'm not using it in the sense of physics. I'm just using it in a mental imagery sense. We control two things in piano playing, and that's all. Exactly when do we play the note, and how fast does the key go down? That's the actual mechanics of making music. There's much emotion that goes into creating beauty, but in terms of what are we actually doing, and timing every note, something we overlook. Rhythm and counting are not just 1, 2, 3, 4. There's an exact moment to play every note, which sometimes will come after the mathematical division that the way the music's shown on the page. But there's a right moment to each of us as interpreters as we see it to play. And then how fast do we put the key down? A slow descent is going to bring you very little sound, and a fast descent is going to bring you a different sound. I think this is really where playing's at, to get as much variety as we can. When I was young, I spent much more time playing baseball than at the piano, and I'm very thankful that my piano teacher put up with me and didn't kick me out during a lot of those years before I decided to work really hard, which is when I was 14. And I really owe sort of everything to that teacher, because he gave me so many hours and hours and hours of free time to help me grow. And anyway, he died a few years ago. He was only 20 when I was 14. No, when I was 6, there was a 14-year age spread, so he was always sort of like a big brother. But anyway, I've always been a baseball fan, but I think it's relevant to playing the piano, because you look at who are the great pitchers, and they're like Greg Maddux, and Trevor Hoffman. I don't think there's very many people old enough, including me, Randy Jones way back. None of us had these blazing fastballs 100 miles an hour that some of these pitchers can't even control at that speed. They mastered the craft. Hoffman threw that same 74 mile an hour changeup and the same, 84, 89 mile an hour fastball. It's not much of a fastball, but he did it all with guile. He did it with varying the speed and keeping the batter in suspense and having perfect control in terms of the location. That's what pitching's about. Just a week or so ago, Tim McCarver was making the point that the plate's 18 inches wide, and great pitchers work with 1.5 inches on each side. And we as a pianist, we've got 3/8 of an inch in the drop in there to work with. That's it. That's where the artistry's made. That's what in part separates the greatest of pianists from others. So I think our model doesn't have to be the 100-mile-an-hour pitcher. Some of us are that, some of us aren't. I'm not. But these guys in the Hall of Fame are there with great success over a long period of time just because of the variety and the control that they had. And you look at Horowitz, is it really that he could play loud or fast? And sometimes he didn't even play all that fast. But it's just, there was such incredible variety in the sound and such unpredictability that with that quixotic temperament, you never knew quite what to expect next, and it kept you on the edge of your seat. And sometimes he overdid it, and it wasn't always perfect, but it was special. It was memorable. And any level of player can work with this level of speed of the key descent. So I make it seem very analytical, and there's more behind it than that. But if we look at that as our tool, rather than feeling that we're just playing notes and then wanting to add feeling on top of that, there's a methodology that we can unite the two. I, years ago, suggested that people would sort of take one note and maybe start from nowhere and then build it bigger, so each one, it may be up to get the 10th one the loudest, and then start down again to make each one a little less than what's before, just an exercise in tonal control. And I was excited to read that one of the students said of Chopin, he made me practice, first of all, constantly varying the attack of one single note, and showed me how he could obtain diverse sonorities from the same key by striking it 20 different ways. So that's all of our assignment, is to just explore what can we do in that little bit of territory that we have to work with in there. He insisted on a real and exactly graduated increase and decrease in loudness. Shade the scale of nuances with infinite gradations between pianissimo and fortissimo, were Chopin's instructions to his students. In simple repeated notes and octaves, don't leave the key, but simply let the finger be softly pushed back up by the key itself. I think this is a very important point. I've called it I think I called it rebound there, I'm not sure. That was Liszt's term for it. Liszt was undoubtedly talking about the same thing. And whether we're dealing with slower playing or even more valuably, when it's faster, what you want to get is that feeling that you play the key and the key sends you on to the next note. I use the image, it's like a trampoline, that we go down and it helps throw us to the next. So often we go down and we key bend. We think, well, I got to go to the bottom of the key. And then we get down and we're stuck. Then it takes an effort to get up again. I mean, I see some of these big animals at the zoo or something, they've sat down, and some of them, it takes forever for them to get up, and some hardly ever sit down. I mean, it's not part of their physiology to be able to get up very well. And I think so often we want to have that same imagery, that our hand and arms are almost like a cat. They're just so supple. I mean, the way that cats can jump out of trees and leap around and do all this stuff, there's no stiffness in there. And that's what we want to have, is that feeling that we use the key. And I love Steinways especially, because they really have that quality of just letting us just move right to the, and any good piano should have that. But change it may help with a child if they're just doing that, to think to the bottom of the key. But for serious longer-term pianists, I don't use that imagery at all. That's not what we want. It's often taught. But you want to just go to the key spot. There's a spot you have to go beyond. And then you want to be on to where you're going. Don't settle, don't dig, don't press, don't push. Just become a part of the key, and then don't inhibit going onwards. Really, once we start a piece, no matter how long it is, I like to feel it's just one series of motions to the next. Rather than stopping and demonstrating, we'll pick it up later when I do the examples. And just let that take care of itself. We don't have to think about pushing up or jerking, and it's not a matter of doing that with the wrist. It's just being aware. You can play the key and then be on to where we're going. And as a sound, we get that lifting quality to the playing. That I think much playing is down. I almost always want up. If I want a very dead sort of effect of just hopelessness, then I may end a piece in that. We'll give a little more sense of lift to it all. And we think if somebody's running, there's that sense of almost pushing off the ground, and you're never settling on the ground. There's a buoyancy that you just spring. Great music making has that same spring in the rhythm. It dances rather than plods, and we can exploit the instrument with that. Chopin took infinite pains to teach the pupil the legato and cantabile way of playing. He doesn't know how to join two notes together was his severest censure. He called playing that was not legato a pigeon hunt, and said the fingers should be reluctant to leave the keys. And of his playing, the tones melted together as in the most beautiful singing. And legato, it's where it's at to me. One can't sing at the piano if there isn't legato. I first wanted to address how do we get a beautiful sound on one note. And yes, the physics doesn't matter so much whether one has a fat finger or a thin finger or whether you think emotionally or what. When we play one note, I could bring in a metal machine, and if it went down at the key at the speed that we desired, it would be fine. But the artistry depends on how do we go to the next note. We don't play one note. And that's where all the ease, the suppleness, the imagination, the inner ear hearing, the plan for the piece, the emotion that we feel, that's where that's so important, is going from note to note. So legato is what we need. Legato is not so much a matter of just finding a fingering that allows us to connect one note to the next. I'm very aware of wanting to have what I would consider legato fingers, but what I've come to the conclusion is that it's a suppleness in the hand combined with legato fingers, because if we're tense and tight, even if we use consecutive fingers, we still may end up with two accents. Legato in large part is in the ear of hearing a line, and you can even fake a legato to a listener from using the same finger on two consecutive notes if you relate those notes together and make a line out of them. So certainly addressing legato in terms of choice of fingerings is part of it, but it's also acquiring a suppleness of the wrist that is so very important. And this suppleness was Chopin's great object, one of the students wrote. He repeated without ceasing during the lessons, facilement. I'm probably mispronouncing the French, but it means easily, easily. And the student said stiffness exasperated him. He advocated the elbow level with the keys. That's my goal for everybody. My goal is not to get people to sit lower than I do. Many of my students, or I've suggested, sit higher. The important thing is address where we're sitting. To simply sit on a bench at one height, how could it possibly make sense? A bench that fits a 6-year-old is going to fit a 60-year-old or a 16-year-old. All of our dimensions are sort of unique and individual. And it doesn't have to do with height or anything else. Some books say tall people sit this way and shorter people sit that. Well, the issue is is one long-waisted or short-waisted, and they have long legs or short legs. The legs are really irrelevant when we're seated. The goal is simply to get the arm level with the key. This is what I call level. Some people have asked, was it measured from? I just want to put the arm down and be like this. I don't want to be down here. I don't want to be up here. I don't want to be up here. So I've had to have a specially made bench constructed for me that puts me at approximately the right height. Because even the adjustable ones, generally around 18 to 22 inches, and 18 isn't low enough for me. I would be in physical discomfort. I couldn't play as efficiently. Now here, because we've got the coasters and pretty hefty wheel and so on with it, I need a little more height over what my bench does. So I have the music there for now, because I just want to be level with the keys. So my suggestion to everybody is analyze at home. I had a formula actually at one time. It's a little bit complicated, but just observe yourself. Are you sitting at a height that makes you level with the keys? The wrist is going to vary a little bit depending on how you're playing, and it's not something of get it down to the certain quarter of an inch. But if people are 3 or 4 inches different, either higher or lower, there can be physical discomfort, and we're not at maximum efficiency. There's a lot of people who advocate what I am here. It's not just my own eccentric idea or anything. And when I'm going through this whole thing with the body, it's really not that I'm saying here's what you have to do or it's the only way to do it, but here are parameters we may not have thought about. And certainly the bench height is one of them. That was part of my recovery when I could play again. Wasn't 100% that, but if it hadn't been for finding the right height for me to sit, all the rest of it, which there are many components of, wouldn't have worked. It was one of the ingredients that was essential, not the only one, but one of them. The wrists. I think the wrist is just so important. I can't convey it enough. In order to have the looseness, the flexibility, the freedom, and for the sound, that there's a feeling that the wrist have some give in it, that it's not locked. Very often chords get played with the wrist is tightened and people press. And then if they lower the arm and so on, we'll get that sound. You get a plenty big sound with the wrist having a give. Now, if you got the wrist too low and you put a give on it in there, then you're a carpal tunnel candidate, which pianists usually don't get because we usually don't play like that. But sometimes people who never had any instruction or something are around like that, and that'll lead to that problem. So the wrist has to be high enough in order for there to be a little bit of a dip and a give with it. Don't start too low. But very often the wrist is locked in one place. So, and the answer isn't doing lots of wrist things like this. What the wrist was meant to do is work in conjunction with the arm so that it has a little give in it, which is basically invisible. If it helps you a little just to do some little exercises to do that, that'll be fine. But ultimately in playing, it's microscopic, but it's there. And if the wrist locks, the fingers can't work, everything's tied up, and the tone doesn't work. Said of Chopin, he found guilt with my stiff wrist. He wanted the hand to lie as though dead at the wrist. His wrist was in constant motion. The action of the wrist is analogous to taking a breath in singing. The wrist equals the respiration in the voice. Someone said at every point where a singer would take a breath, one should take care to raise the wrist so as to let it fall again as the singing tone with the greatest suppleness imaginable. He wanted the hand to be held as though suspended in the air without weight. It was interesting, he didn't talk about arm weight. He desired the hand to fall softly on the keys with its own weight. So I just kind of summarized, we want the arms to feel light and free, not heavy and weighty. And really there's several motions that can be made at the piano. The arm can go in, and sometimes that can help solve a passage if we just think of going in a little more or coming out a little more. We've also got a forearm rotation that goes side to side, and our wrist can go up and down. Pretty much that's all the motions the arm can make. We don't really need to do much with the upper arm in here, just stay loose. So it's really the forearm. Is it in and out? Is it side to side? And is the wrist free? And very often we're making motions that combine all of those. The fingers should fall freely and lightly. Think if we take the model of having the hand at the side, bring it up to the keyboard, what happens naturally? It won't come up flat because it's not flat down here. But what we do is tend to come up, ready, set, and then curve. Because way back in the early days, the student was a little slovenly at age 6, so the teacher gave a general model, curved the fingers, and then for a lifetime we sort of felt like we have to stay very curved. But that was just a general guideline. I like the term rounded. I really don't like the word curved. Because the hand should be natural. The perfect hand, Earl Wilde said it, and I think it's so true, is like the Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, where you've got God and Adam, and those hands are like that. Michelangelo had studied so much physiology. He knew a natural hand position. It's just like that. That's a playing position. It's you're all set. The hand is open. We often tense the thumb. Then when that's tight, the whole hand gets tight. And I feel if the second finger, an effort can be made to stay flexible and not so tight. If we pull in the second finger, all the others start tensing as well. It's kind of my own thought. But if we can keep that second finger very free and the thumb that releases the hand, then we're free to move. It's our rhythmic sense that gives the precision. It's not so much the drill of playing 16th-note scales as fast as we can and figuring we'll build up muscular strength. The people with the great techniques have great instinctive rhythm. And rhythm's tied in with great technique. They're really sort of inseparable. And if we sharpen our rhythm and really feel little groups of 16th notes, that'll sharpen them up. Then we get them even at a modest speed, go a little bit faster, that group of 4. That'll do more than just plain slaving away at trying through willpower to play faster and faster and build finger strength. It's nervous system response, I think, that can make a great technician at the piano, as well as tied in with that rhythm. It's not so much finger strength. What was he exactly? I don't know. Somebody measured my fingers once back when I was having a hand problem. Some medical establishment told me I had very weak hand, very weak fingers, and so on. Well, that's true. But also, they said, but they're very agile and they're very supple. That's what a pianist wants, is joints that aren't locked tight, but have that flexibility about them. It's not finger strength, it's timing of the note. So, because strength comes from rhythm. That's what Horowitz had too. As you can tell, the generation I am, I saw Horowitz, I saw Rubinstein, and they were my heroes, as well as several others. But that electrifying sense of precisely when he wanted a note played, maybe we thought it was a little mannered or something, but that control of just electrifyingly being so exact, that's really tied in so much with technique. So we're all going to increase our technique, increase our facility by increasing the relaxation, providing we don't let our rhythm become slovenly with it. But let the fingers fall and not lift the finger. Those old books, Pishna and so on, I burn those. It's not that we don't, of course we do scales, and there can be exercises if they're carefully done that are very valuable. But I think some of those old instructions from Hannon in 1890 or whenever it was written, lift each finger or something, that's a very quick way to get hand problems. The hand wasn't meant so much to be lifted and banged down on keys. I think we can get from doing scales intelligently much more, and I certainly believe in that. I'm not in a school that says you get all your technique from your pieces. As a very much older pianist, I think that's true, but you don't tell an 8-year-old they're going to get all their technique from the pieces. It's not going to happen. But I think intelligent practicing of any exercises that are being done, and 5-finger patterns can do, or Hannon number 1 is fine, but you need guidance in exactly how you're doing that, or there can be a lot of problems, and it's not worth ending our playing career playing things ergonomically wrong. And the suppleness extends the whole body. Chopin said have the body supple to the tip of the toes. And I just point out, we can think about, where is our left foot best? I've solved some passages by going out here with my left foot so that I get the leverage to come up here, or it encourages me to come down here. Sometimes I found I do better if the left foot is back. Sometimes I'll do better if the left foot is forward. It's not a major issue if I'm playing Schumann Tormer. It's not an issue at all. But in bigger pieces, La Sonata or something, it's really a matter of how to use the body ergonomically the most sensible way, which we can discover through playing and analyzing, because to figure a technical problem, we need to come up with a mental solution which will often allow the whole body. Body should be able to move in, it should be able to move back. We want to get in front of what we're playing. If we've got stuff up here, we can't make it while we're sitting back here, like Rubinstein doing this in a nocturne. We're going to have to use a little different approach. I would play Haydn a little bit differently than I would play a Chopin nocturne. So again, not giving all the answers because there aren't any, it's an evolution. But think about how is the body being utilized in that. I favor sitting up. I don't favor hunching down. I don't think we can hear as well, and I think we've compressed the chest then. And I can't croak a note, but I'm a singer at heart. I love opera. Singers have always been my models as musicians, and I think that's what it's at. And I've never had a voice lesson, but we've all seen them sing. They project. They open up. The lung space is open. And that's what we really need. I think the more expansive the piece, the more we need that, especially for the romantic music. So I favor one's head being up much of the time. Apparently Chopin's head was up. He didn't look at the score, and they said he tended to look off to the left. And we don't have to emulate that. But even thinking, where are the eyes? Joseph Gott has in his book the idea one's eyes should be out looking where the hammers strike the strings, because that's where the sound is being made. I don't know whether there's anything to that or not, but Rubinstein always said he didn't want to watch the keys because he could hear a line much better if he didn't. I don't watch them so much myself. It's different again in a certain piece, one to another. But just giving some thought, not where's your eye every second of a piece, but maybe in a passage you may get better results by thinking about the entire body. Am I better in? Am I better back? Where I need to go to the side? And generally keeping the head and neck up. So reviewing, press the key, vary the speed of key descent, don't press, legato, suppleness everywhere. Now to the interpretive items. Rhythm is everything. And I want to talk more about that than anything else. We'll speed through the rest and we'll do all those two examples from the music. I hope people brought some scores along. I mean, that old thing of Duke Ellington, it don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing. That's That's it in interpretation. That is far, we concern ourselves so much with, did I get the right dynamics and how do I shape this phrase and was my tone exquisite? But meanwhile, the tempo can be not in the best interest of the piece. And I sound a little dogmatic by talking about the best interest of the piece. I'm not saying there's one metronome marking and it's my marking and everybody else is wrong. But selecting the right tempo was what Beethoven always wanted. Of course, he couldn't hear so many performances. He didn't go to many concerts. You know, if it was a premiere of his own, he was there and he could see the tempo they were playing by how the violins were going. But if he wasn't there, he would always ask, how were the tempi? Verdi was a fanatic on it. And Verdi put metronome marks all through those operas, and they're largely ignored today. Basically, all the composers' metronome marks have been ignored because we don't like them. And so we say their metronome had to be broken. That's been said of Beethoven, it's been said of Chopin, it's been said of Schumann widely. And books have stated that they are, and that so-and-so who wasn't actually there said that it was broken, and so on. We don't want to believe the fact that Beethoven took things incredibly fast, if they were fast pieces, and that almost always, until we get to an era of Mahler and that type of thing, slow tempi were not nearly as slow as we'd like to think they are. It's just what the truth shows. And I think we need to know that and keep it in mind. I'll show as Schumann Kinderszenen later. I'm not saying we should slavishly take a metronome mark of a composer and feel obligated to do it. We can't. The instrument is different. We may not be the same disposition, but we've got to know what their mark is and let it influence us so we can meet them part way with it. Or if we're determined to do something very different, have a very good reason why we think we should be very different with it. C.P. Bach said the way to find tempo is find your fastest passages, make sure they're not rushing. Find your slowest passage, make sure that they're not dragging. Schumann said dragging and hurrying are equally great faults. And I mean, for one example today, I think it's a disgrace how we hear the national anthem. I mean, everybody's making it a vehicle for themselves. It doesn't fit the character of the words. And it's what's happening a lot, I think, in classical music playing as well. And it's the same indulgence that I think is a mistake. The tempo is part of the piece. It's the most important part. A lot of motives don't work if there's a tempo that doesn't make sense, and have a swing and have a lilt that's in there. I don't want to talk a long time at all, but we all play Bach, and I think we're playing the fast things way too fast, usually, if we can do it. I'm talking to the people we hear. And the slow things way too slow. There's enough scholarship that we can count on that I feel very confident making that statement. That Turk, who was a writer in 1792, wrote that tempo is sped up twice since what it was 50 years ago. When Bach wrote 32nd notes, they're not that fast. And he was fast for his era. He was fiery. That's what the speed demons come back and say, well, Bach was fiery. He was on the speed side of his era, but his era was slow. And Haydn helped speed up speed. Early Haydn's a lot slower than even later. Beethoven was fast. Mendelssohn was unbelievably fast. And then things slowed up, so it's not that different than today, I would generalize. But how did the Baroque go after their tempi? They didn't have metronomes. It was the meter and the note values, but that's a whole other subject. Classical era added then designations, and Mozart was changing around all the time, and so was Schubert. Is it allegro? Is it allegro moderato? Is it allegro con vivo? That sort of thing, because that was a hint that would change the tempo. And those words also mean character. So some people say, well, they're only character words, so they have nothing to do with the tempo. They're both. But just as background for Chopin, because he did give metronome marks up until in the Opus 20s, until 1835, and then he stopped doing it. And that happened with a lot of composers. Believe it or not, there's 9 Schubert metronome marks, 13 Schubert metronome marks, but they're all for songs, none for keyboard music. But I've looked at 9 of those, and it's very interesting. The fast things are not super fast, and the slow things are not as slow as the singers take them today. Chopin, as I say, did these metronome marks, and people say, well, they're so fast for the slow pieces, and the fast things are too fast, and so on. When you actually look at them, a lot of them make sense. But I'll come back to that in a minute. Brahms has some metronome marks. They're mostly for the German Requiem. But then he withdrew them, and he said, they're not going to help The general comment a lot of these musicians have made is if you're not musical, they won't help you, and if you're musical, you don't need them. But there are marks for the B-flat concerto. I don't think they're in most editions, but they are seen as authentic, and they're exactly what Horvitz and Toscanini take on their recording, if you're curious what they're, and they work. But it's kind of a myth that older people like Bach, yes. We want to say pace of life is slower, Bach's tempi are slower than today. Yeah, that's right. But do we want to drag that in and say, oh, Brahms should be slow? And you hear the D minor concerto, now that first movement is a dirge. There's also a metronome mark for that. Serpin used to move it, but now we're into this self-indulgency of playing two slow movements. You got a 23-minute first movement and a 15-minute second movement. Brahms didn't write two slow movements in a row. So slow things move enough. Fast things, I feel, don't play beyond what we can play cleanly and accurately as well. Also, a lot of people say, well, the tempo fluctuates. Of course it does. So the metronome is to establish a basic tempo. What Chopin may have even put as a metronome may not be for the first measure. Sometimes he's put espressivo or sostenuto or something in the beginning. He's put a metronome mark for the bulk of the piece a little later on. It's going to fluctuate, of course it will. And also, even if the composer says metronome mark, eighth note means this, that doesn't mean we have to beat an eighth note and feel that. We can feel the quarter notes. We can feel half notes instead of quarter notes some of the time. Chopin's markings are often moderato, allegretto, andante, larghetto. He doesn't use adagio except near the end of the piece, which simply means slow up. And he doesn't use largo, it's moving. Then he advised his students not to fragment a musical idea, but carry it in one breath. He drew from the instrument the secret of how to express breathing. Listened frequently to singers, and he made the students take voice lessons in some cases. We can all go see the high-definition Metropolitan Opera this coming Saturday. It's Tosca. I really don't think pianists listen to enough opera. Look up metropolitanopera.org. It'll list the movie theaters closest, and you'll be following Chopin's instructions of seeing singers. We need a plan of relationships in the pieces. How does every note relate to every other note? Music is organized sound. And the feeling is nothing till we've organized it in something comprehensible. We need to use our head and our hearts. We can feel this away from the piano by hearing it, by walking it, by singing it, experimenting at the piano, but we need to pre-hear before we play. Music's a language, and we're orators. All the treatise writers wrote this. We deal with stressed and unstressed notes, chords, beats. There's two types of stress. There's the amount of duration. Are we going to hold it a little extra longer, or are we going to strike it a little bit heavier? An accent can be either one. And Chopin himself said, a long note is stronger. A dissonant note is likewise stronger, and equally so a syncopated note. Notice must be taken of natural accents. In a bar of 2, the first note is strong, the second is weak. In a bar of 3, the first is strong and the other is weak. The smaller parts of the bar, the same direction will apply. Such are the rules. The exceptions are indicated by the authors themselves. So, taking some examples of music, I think we need to skeletonize the score. I've got a nocturne up here. The E minor, Opus 72, number 1, posthumous. It's actually the first nocturne. And what I look at it, I see the opening G. I see the D sharp. I see the B, the first B to the next measure, and then I see the first B to the next measure. I see a long note on the first measure. I see a long note on the second measure, a fairly long note on the next measure. So before getting engrossed on each and every note and what fingering will I use and everything, before that, I see a left hand of triplets. I want to find what is the pulse just of those notes, and I don't want to do accenting. A little bit on the first note, and then the others almost have to hurry and catch up to the. I'm exaggerating, but this is there. Then these go to here, these go to here, these go to here, these go to here. I'm going to do that through the whole piece. Every downbeat is an arrival. It's not a beginning. It's good if one doesn't play all notes the same and even sort of treats the first one as a beginning. That's better than making all notes the same. But the real flow in the piece comes from moving ahead, grouping notes so that they move to the next measure, move to the next beat, move to the next dissonance, move to the next long note, so that they aren't the same. Now, another important idea. After this G, it's died. Nothing we can do on the piano to make that crescendo. Singer can crescendo, wind player can crescendo, string player can crescendo. We're stuck. It's dying. So the F sharp has to enter and match what's left of that long note. Now, what you then do is fine. It doesn't mean that the F sharp is to be soft, the E is to be soft, and everything has to be after a long note is soft for ages. But it's just when you then continue to underplay that first note. The same concept comes if we're starting from nowhere. I'll have plenty of examples. I wrote start in there. That's applicable if we're coming out of a rest. Same thing. Or even if it's the beginning of a phrase that's going to build, we usually don't go low enough, which gives us then more room to go higher. We all know to round off phrases, but if you think about it, it's a matter of starting from somewhere, then rounding off at the end, matching if we've got long notes, and also I wrote save in there because often in long successions of chords we need to drop back and come down so that we can build up again, or we get 10 straight loud chords that have no line. And a line is what makes music. So just in the opening, a little bit on Chopin ornamentation. The B goes on the beat. Appositors in Chopin on the beat, just like they are for Scarlatti, Bach, Haydn, Mozart. As a generality, with all ornamentation, ask yourself, is it mainly harmonic? Is it mainly rhythmic? Is it mainly melodic? What's the purpose of the ornament? We have these guidelines that aren't rules because there's occasional exceptions, but they're definitely guidelines. And this B does not come ahead and the G comes with that. It's not my opinion. Chopin taught it. It's shown hundreds of places in his scores where he drew arrows in the score and everything. Now, every appositor is not like every other appositor. We've got long appositors. Which of those kinds of ones where you've got a big harmonic crunch, you want to squeeze all the juice you can out of that dissonance, and it's going to be long. You're probably going to hold it longer even than the score says, and it's going to be louder. But we forget there's a lot of short appositors, and almost every appositor that's larger than a major or minor second is a short one. It goes on the beat, but it's light. The purpose there on that B is not to treat it as if it's a dissonance. It's not a dissonance, but it's on the beat. And what it does, it forces the G to be late. And so it brings an expressive effect into things, which is tied into his rubato. His rubato is not like the whole texture varying which we associate rubato today. His rubato descended for hundreds of years before him, where the accompaniment to the singer would stay steady and the singer would come in early or the singer would come in late. The violinist would come in early, the violinist would come in. It's very imperceptible, it's very small, but they didn't believe in what we're taught today. Every right hand has to be with every left hand, or it's wrong, it's in poor taste, and it's terrible. It's the way music existed for a couple of hundred years. Very subtle, and if you overdid it, it was poor taste and terrible. But Chopin clearly brought in notes, usually a little late, but sometimes a little bit early. But it had to be subtle, and sometimes he could weave a whole variety of notes where they're coming a little early and a little late. But Liszt said you had to see Chopin do it, hear Chopin do it to really understand what it could be like. I'm not recommending we all run out and try and do an extended set of rubato of several notes. I've got the places that Chopin marked rubato, just like his metronome marks. When he stopped writing metronome marks, he stopped writing rubato in there as well. Didn't mean it wouldn't have been done. But what I adapt and think we can go back and do more of is having single notes a little bit displaced from important bass notes. It has to be very subtle. Whenever you start to do it, you'll overdo. But if it's subtle, it adds such an additional dimension, and it's historically grounded. What happened was Chopin did it, the great pianists did it, then Paderewski and de Pachmann around 1910 were overdoing it. So Rachmaninoff and Bozzoni and Hoffman and others said, oh, this is terrible, don't do it at all. So they squelched a long tradition that went back hundreds of years because a few people overdid it. There is a Leschetizky recording. You can really hear him doing this from 1903. So I think we need to go back to what's a little more historically based and allow ourselves subtly to do it. So on a few of those notes, important notes, I'm just a little bit late on important notes. Not trying to draw attention to it, but just allowing it to happen. If it feels natural, if you don't feel it, don't do it. Don't do something that somebody else suggests if one doesn't feel it. But it's another parameter of expressiveness that we can exploit. What else is here to see? That feeling. I take a little time on the first one, and the next 3/8 notes move. Now, there's really a shocking harmony of G major coming after E minor. We don't quite expect it right away there. There we've got that B and the C sharp. We need that alto voice. There's the dissonance. Look for the dissonances, bring them out. They're longer and they're louder. And that's really what interpretation's about. Find the dissonances, highlight them. I bring that B out as much as the C sharp. We're going to get another C sharp there anyway. The interesting thing is the B, and so on. Bass notes, the E, the F sharp, the D sharp, the B, then the G. That's what's holding everything together. G. Sorry for the bad pedal. This F sharp, it's the dominant seventh chord, resolves to its tonic, the B minor in here. I'm going to want to follow that. I'm going to go down there. Now, in the little variation that comes in with the octaves, make sure we don't hit the G. They're too heavy. And a match. And there's that dissonance, that crunch. Now in here, there's that old sort of generality. If it goes up, it gets louder. Well, that's often true in music. But in a lot of this very poetic music, it's more magical, the diminuendo a little bit. Now there we get the B minor. Now then, C major, it's a Neapolitan. For those who know theory. If we don't have the theory, our ear isn't as sharp to pick up that relationship, if we move to B minor, is then going to C. So we want to feel that we're in a very shocking territory there. This section's going to move a tiny bit. I start at 63. It's the tempo I find right. Maybe I want to go a click faster. That's making the harmony so important. At one point I wrote, set up the important arrivals here. You want a little bit of time to set that up. That's the highest note we've gotten to in that little section. Then there's the dissonance. An alto voice to follow. And then the magic of the B major. Float into these notes. una corda in there? All depends. I'm not an advocate of a huge amount of una corda, but it's another tool that we have. It's a very special spot there. This piano doesn't need it. You can get plenty soft sound without it. And if you're playing on an instrument that's very hard to control, maybe you want to use it there. When we measure 27, it's a forte, but so often I hear when it's marked forte, people hit. Just pull the warm sound out. It is forte compared to where we've been, but we don't want to hit it. Right before the sort of recapitulation, we've got one little B appoggiatura ahead of the beat and the other one with it. That shows Chopin doesn't want that. Goes back to these. Now we've got a TR in here. If you sneak those ahead of the beat, it's okay. It's a different category than the appoggiaturas, where they need to come on the beat. If it's a slow piece, like measure 36, where we've got the trill, the B with the trill sign of the upper note, when it's really visible to the audience, play the upper note. If it's slow enough that you can really hear that. But this little trill in there is just an appendage to it's a rhythmic figure. It's not so important to get harmonic punches that we need later on. So if you start on the main note, some of the trills, the fast trills can start on the main note, and especially when you see the little squiggly sign, those can be 3 notes ahead. It's more when you've got a big fat whole note or half note that you're going to want to start on the note above and make a point on that. Now here, this D sharp is with the left hand. It's not there, but it's fast, fairly fast. Often just gets ripped off. One can be very expressive with that. And again, we know in needing 3 Bs, we've already got a B, so those can be soft. Can be expressive even though it's fast in there. It's not just a passage, there's a crescendo. And often a crescendo, the hairpin sign, means an intensification more than it has to get super loud. Looking a few measures later, they're around 40 or so. There's this figure. The rest in the middle of a triplet. That's often something to prolong a little bit, shorten the note. Got a couple of accents in a row. That's a stretching. And to set up, I would take some time to not just walk into it. That's too great of a moment. Let's set it up. Up to B, we go up to C sharp, we go up to C, we go up to a B. Those great old time pianists pulled out these inner voices to not detract from a melody, but to add another dimension. That awareness does it. We don't want to exaggerate, but being aware of what's in a score. A Chopin score has so many levels of sound. Here now we've really got 4 voices. We've got a G sharp, we've got an E that goes to D and then C sharp. We got this little voice down here that comes up here. We got a left hand that has a low note, and then we got really 5 voices, and we got another one in here. There's the long appoggiatura. I often hear that, which zaps the whole place of mood. The dissonance is the F sharp. third is always important in chords, that we hear enough of in there. But we want enough of the tonic in there. So there's just so many things to notice. As far as other nocturnes, just a quick, the second one, the E flat, the left hand is always so loud. That can just be so soft. The D flat nocturne, number 8. There, he mentions con forza measure 8. Be careful with con forza. And so on, that it's still a warm enough tone. When there's a sforzando in a nocturne, that it has meaning, that it has intensity, but that it's not harsh. It's interesting to look at different manuscript sources. Over at measure 46, some editions have a pianissimo, other editions have fortissimo. They're both correct. Chopin, there's a French edition, a German edition, a London edition, and the autograph edition. And as Chopin got back the proofs, he changed things. So he had, and from performance to performance, he changed things. In the Barcarolle, some eyewitness accounts said he did as the score said, fortissimo at the climactic moment when the theme returns. Other sources say sometimes he played pianissimo at that spot. So you can take measure 45 and crescendo it. You can take measure 45 and diminuendo it. I like the crescendo because we've already heard the theme twice when it's very, very soft in there. Con forza, again over here, 57. Be not harsh with the sound. That big cadenza up to 52, it can be free, it can be expansive. Those big cadenzas don't have to be rattled off mechanically. Con anima is a tricky word. Literally means with soul, but Chopin tends to use it with animation. So that's something to be careful about. The G minor nocturne, composers are human, and apparently a student said that Chopin, that's Opus 37, number 1, the middle section of that, Chopin forgot to mark più mosso there. And it is obvious if you look at the piece that it's, those chords are going to be utterly stagnant. It's the same tempo as what's appropriate for the rest of the piece. A lot, the B major nocturne, 32, number 1. The end of that's a recitative. But I just thought I wanted to mention that because so often people don't catch the operatic basis of that it is wild and impulsive. And also the minor, because some editions have a major triad at the end. The minor is a better choice in that spot. So just a few thoughts about nocturnes. Mazurkas are the hard. Oh, well, one quick C-sharp minor waltz. So fast. The tempo giusto doesn't, there's two meanings for giusto. One is exact time, but I can't imagine he meant no rubato here. The more common usage actually was sort of the right time. When you look at the history of tempo, back in the Renaissance, they had a sort of pulsation that was probably in the 60s or 70s as far as beats per minute, like our metronome. That's often been thought that an awful lot of music centers around 70. Is that because it's a walking speed? Is that because it's a heart rate and a blood pressure rate? Who knows? But this basic sort of not too fast, not too slow tempo. I'm not giving an exact number, but I'm talking 69, 72, 66, 76. That was sort of assumed to be the medium. If it's faster than that, it's fast. If it's slower than that, it's slow. So tempo giusto you'll find in a lot of music, and it's thought to be around this 69-ish sort of area. So tempo giusto here, 138 would be double. The tempo giusto is 138, sorry. I'm saying that's twice the 69. But the Schubert uses allegro giusto in one spot in there. So I take a tempo of about 138 in there. Then he says a little faster, so I go to 168. Seems a lot of people double it in there. Rosenthal is a great Chopin interpreter, and I was happy recently to come across his report. He's 132 on the first page. He's 168 on the second page. I take the third page. So, somebody once said tradition is laziness. And I think just because we've heard this piece a certain way from some interpreters, it doesn't make it right. I think the opening here, you can slightly rubato over there. So there's alto voices galore when it comes back. On the second page, a little slur on each one of these measures. When it repeats later on the page, it's one big long phrase. So I think he has in mind an emphasis lingering a little bit on that first one. He marks the accent. That's not to beat the note, but to hold it. And even on this little crescendo, you can then relate the harmony, stronger, weaker, and so on. Then the second time, maybe less pedal and a little bit faster in there. The two don't have to be carbon copies of each other. The third page, I hear that F, just prolonging. Now I pick up the G flat. Now I pick up the A flat. Now the highest note, which the tendency might be to hit, but it can be the softest, and so on. Follow the bass line. And we're down here. There's that polyphonic. Something doesn't have to be a fugue to be polyphonic. You got a tenor line going in here and a bass line down in there. So much color that we can get. The mazurkas are the real heart and soul of Chopin. And I have the C-sharp minor of Opus 50, number 3, I wanted to go over. The main ingredient of mazurkas is a Polish word zal, which is, they say, untranslatable, but it's a melancholy, it's a nostalgia. But they're loaded with a wildness and an intensity and an improvisatory quality. They're a family of dances. The Kuźwiak is the more lamenting, moderate one. The Obertas or the Oberek is the fast, exuberant one. Examples of the Oberek would be Opus 68, number 1, or 33, number 2. But this one is more, and the Mazur is also like the Kuźwiak, a more lamenting, sort of slower one in there. And the mazurka rhythms are unwritten. In fact, Chopin, when he was playing them for his, for some friends, the conductor, Halle, said, "Frederick, you're playing it in 4, it's in 3. And Chopin said, no, they're in 3, and replayed it some more. And Halle said, "I'm counting 4. Same thing happened when Meyerbeer, the composer, showed up. He said, "Frederick, I'm counting 4. What Chopin was doing was bringing the second beats so early, sort of like what you do in a Viennese waltz. every beat of every mazurka. But in these types of rhythms, like where you get 2/8 and 2/4 notes, measure 45. Or there's all that type of figure occurs so often through Chopin. But that's the authentic way to do it. Bring second beat a little early, third a little late. Now he notates a lot of accents what to do over on measure 17. We don't just play through as it's written, as if it's more of a waltz 1, 2, 3. It's got these crazy disruptions of rhythm that actually, if you were going to notate it, sometimes it would look like Bartok or Stravinsky might have been a 3/4, and then a 2/4, and then a 5/4, and then that's Eastern European rhythms rather than the more predictable Western European ones. This opening note, one can just caress that sound, get it to ring, whatever you want, and then match. It's not going anywhere. The harmony's just sitting there like. It's that same kind of sound. Or build to the third one. Anything can work in there. Like in here, you've got two, same thing twice. Second one different. It can be anything. Think of the tempo. I want to cite some metronome marks in this piece, just to show how much variety is appropriate in a metric. I'll range between 132 and 152. I'm just making the point, it's not one tempo for the whole piece, but something's not twice as fast as the other. I'll start as slow as it gets in the piece, just so that doesn't feel rushed. This takes... That may have gone to 144. Now this is back to the 140. Chopin loves these little cello lines and so on through there. He gives sostenuto. He tells us when to take a little more time. I'm around 62. In this middle section, I picked up to 152 or so, but then he gives us the sostenuto. Lighter in there. 89, he comes to the page. And then you can just let that sound disappear and that's your left. The bass holds together, looking around 135 or so. Have more bite and intensity than a nocturne will. She once said if the Tsar Russian knew what was on those mazurkas, he banned them. There's a huge intensity there, but then it resolved. E major. melodic quality in these mazurkas that has to be allowed to be free and be impulsive and unpredictable. Chopin Scherzo, C sharp minor. D, B flat, C, B flat to A. And then you set up the C sharp. You've got that line to follow. The chords. Each one of those is different. So we have to use those structural points to hold the whole thing together. Then we're going to have A to G, and then it's going to resolve later on in there. For octaves, not heavy, not too deep to the key. Feel groups of three and shape them going somewhere. So often I hear this, it's all just very straightforward. G sharp, then it's going to build, then it's going to go still higher, then it's going to go still higher, and then you top it in there. So the wrist needs to be freed to make a melodic line. There's a shape to it. Then when you get over around 140 or so, that's good. We've had all these G sharps. As we go into that F sharp, set that up. Now we've got those dotted Fs aren't just consecutive notes. There's a line leading to here. There's a spot to match. Let's start piano. It's still a forte section. 3 consecutive A flats, all different. And then start from nowhere. Then what we have to do is pick up from this, not to let the 8 notes disrupt. It's easy to play here, then those, then this. You want to relate the chorale theme. Section. Then when you get to something around 3 and 13, I add the lower octave. I mean, the richness is so valuable at that point. When you're around 335 or so, I just wanted to come in on arpeggios. The standard thing of putting the thumb under doesn't work at tempo. And so on. Or if you're dealing just with standard arpeggios, it's sort of a long subject, but where we're taught to connect that into that nonsense, it doesn't work. The hand needs to be free. In the coda, it's, again, so much going on. You've got these G sharps ringing, you've got a middle voice that's going to build, and you've got a top that needs to be beautiful. point here, you're really following C sharp, B, then the A. He gives these notes. It's more time. They're not just rattled through. Now there, that low F double sharp crunches with the right. It's not ahead of the beat. And again, more time. There's a freedom, I'm missing all the notes now, but I just want to give the idea, it's not just a metronomic race through coda, that there's a musical underpinning, there's the dominant, then you've got the double sharp, then the dominant, then you have this long, then the A, you have the whole piece that is built around that A and G sharp, so you get the A right at the end. Is about right. 76 is going to work well for a theme. Basic Polonaise rhythm's 92, but Chopin doesn't say allegro. He says maestoso, so it's more dignified. It's slower in there. If you want to, that's a very authentic way to play Polonaise, is rushing a little bit the 16th notes. And here's a spot for 32 with the saving. You built onto this. I want to come down here. Each one of these notes leads ahead. This to this, this to this, this to this, this to this. In there, so you get a line. There, he puts the little grace note E ahead. That's not to play it twice. What he's telling us is that is a main note trill, because his assumption is it'll be an upper note trill. When we get over to 49, we've got the big tone in there. My point is just to come way down to then start in the. He gives us a sostenuto, so we could go a little bit slower in there. And there's that Polonaise rhythm again, where you can take the 16ths a tiny bit late. Chopin was horrified when people went too fast. Liszt was horrified when they went too fast and said, you're just trying to show me how fast you can play octaves. It loses the dignity of it in there. And I think those opening chords, they're usually just banged out. I would suggest very full on the big one, and then come down. And build. So the last one is the most, but instead of 7 banged notes, are going to be a little longer than the rest. You don't keep the middle at 76 just because you did 76 earlier. Move it to 84s. light and the wrist fairly high. You're not making separate motions. You get an impulse in each of the four. When there's a great moment, I mean, take the time to walk through that. And then start. Second ending, first ending, then I would come down and slow. Taking that part, taking the second ending. And so on. The middle section is really nocturnal. These low notes Chopin has this words on. They're big bells. He wants us to hear. And there's little movements of the line up in here. And so on. Especially said these were like muffled guns down in these low notes, 143. So it's a beautiful tone, but we hear that going. Over at the end, we're on 169. We got this big line. That's another spot to say. Yeah, why crash through every note? And I don't understand why everybody rushes this last page. There's nothing about a Polonaise that says rush at the end. A Hungarian Csardas is different. We get a direction, and that we sing it so it doesn't sound angry, but it sounds proud like Chopin was of his Polish heritage. On the little handout, I have some suggested interpreters of Chopin, and those first ones have a direct link back. Chopin's student Nicolai taught Kosalski, taught Rosenthal, and that's a direct link back. Leschetizky was Friedman's teacher, and Friedman was one of my favorite pianists of all. Most of these are on YouTube, and you can listen for free, or you can buy all the Friedman recordings, whatever. The earlier Rubinstein's better than the later. Courtaulds wonderful, but those first three go way, way back, and I think they're really the link that we want to listen to. The freedom in a Friedman's playing, and the vitality, and the poetry in this guy Kosalski. He's not so well known, but I urge listening to that. I've gone on so long on Chopin. Schumann's a lot shorter, but I hope I haven't worn you all out. That's all I have on Chopin.